If I had known how it would end, I would have never approached that child. But at that moment, I had no choice. Christian Blake had it all. A luxurious mansion, his own business empire, and more money than he could ever spend. But even money doesn't protect you from people willing to do anything to take it from you. That night, he was returning home after a business dinner with potential investors. The rain was pouring like a waterfall, and the streets were nearly empty. The glow from streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt, making the city look like a maze of shadows and light. Christian had parked his car just a few blocks from his mansion, deciding to walk the rest of the way to clear his head. His thoughts were still on the deal he'd closed, the figures running through his mind, when he heard it. The scream, sharp, piercing, the kind that freezes your blood. Christian stopped in his tracks. The scream had come from somewhere nearby, just around the corner. His heart skipped a beat, then started pounding in his chest. Without thinking, he ran toward the sound. As he rounded the corner, he saw him. A boy, no older than 8, stood in the middle of the road. His small frame was drenched from the rain, his clothes clinging to his skin. His arms were wrapped around his chest, and his eyes were wide with fear, staring straight ahead like he was frozen in place. And then Christian saw the headlights. A car was speeding toward the boy, cutting through the rain like a bullet. The driver wasn't slowing down. Christian didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He bolted into the street. His expensive shoes slipped on the slick pavement, but adrenaline kept him upright. Just as the car was about to hit, Christian lunged, grabbing the boy and throwing them both onto the sidewalk. The car roared past, disappearing into the darkness without even tapping the brakes. Christian lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. The rain beat down on him, cold and relentless, mixing with the sweat on his skin. Beside him, the boy was trembling violently. His face was pale, his lips blue from the cold, but he didn't cry. He didn't make a sound. Christian sat up, brushing the wet hair from his face. He looked down at the boy who was staring at the ground, his body still shaking. "Hey," Christian said gently, his voice calm despite the adrenaline still rushing through his veins. "You're okay now. You're safe. Where are your parents?" The boy didn't answer. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He just sat there, shivering, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something, or someone. Christian's heart ached for the kid. He looked terrified, and something about the whole situation felt off, but he couldn't just leave him there. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Hey, it's all right. You're safe now," he repeated. "Where do you live?" The boy still didn't speak. Instead, with trembling hands, he reached into the pocket of his soaked jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Without a word, he handed it to Christian. Christian unfolded the paper. The rain had smudged the ink, but he could still make out the shaky handwriting. It was an address. Christian frowned. Something about this didn't sit right. Why wasn't the kid speaking? Why was he standing in the middle of the road like that? And why the hell did that car speed up instead of slowing down? But he couldn't just leave the boy there. "All right," Christian sighed, standing up. "Let's get you home." The boy didn't resist. He simply took Christian's outstretched hand and followed him, his small fingers cold and fragile in Christian's grip. The walk to the address was eerily silent. The boy didn't say a word, didn't ask any questions. He just walked beside Christian, his eyes fixed on the ground. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was still thick with tension. Christian kept glancing down at the boy, his mind racing with questions. Why wasn't he talking? Why did he look so scared? And what kind of parents let their kid wander around alone in weather like this? 15 minutes later, they arrived at the address. It was a rundown house at the edge of town. The paint was peeling from the walls, the windows were dark, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. But the thing that made Christian's stomach tighten wasn't the state of the house. It was the front door. It was wide open. Christian stopped, his grip tightening on the boy's hand. "Is this your house?" he asked, glancing down at the boy. The child nodded once, his expression blank. Christian hesitated. Every instinct in his body screamed that something was wrong. But what was he supposed to do? He couldn't just leave the kid here. He stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. He called out, his voice firm but cautious. "Hello? Anyone home?" Silence. Christian waited a few seconds, but no one answered. The house felt wrong, the kind of wrong you couldn't see but could feel in your bones. But he couldn't just leave without making sure. He stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with a strange, metallic scent that made his stomach churn. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, his heart began to race. The living room was a mess. Furniture was overturned, drawers yanked out and emptied onto the floor. Glass from shattered picture frames littered the ground, glittering like tiny knives in the faint light. But what made Christian's blood run cold was the large, dark stain in the middle of the carpet. It was old, but unmistakable. It looked like dried blood. Christian's pulse roared in his ears. He turned back to the boy, ready to demand answers. But the boy was gone. A sharp jolt of panic shot through him. He stepped back onto the porch, looking left and right. Nothing. The street was empty. The boy had vanished. Christian stood there for a long moment, rain dripping from his face, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was very, very wrong. That night, Christian couldn't sleep. He lay in his massive bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over in his mind. Who was that boy? Why was he alone in the middle of the road? And what the hell had happened in that house? Nothing made sense. Just as he was finally drifting into a restless sleep, a loud, sharp knock echoed through his mansion. Christian jolted upright. His heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at the clock. 6:03 a.m. Another knock, louder this time. He threw on a robe and made his way to the front door, his footsteps echoing through the vast, empty halls. When he opened the door, 2 men stood on his doorstep. They wore plain clothes, but the badges clipped to their belts were unmistakable. Christian's heart skipped a beat. It was the police. Christian opened the door and found 2 men in plain clothes standing on his doorstep. One of them held up a badge, its metallic glint catching the morning light. "Are you Christian Blake?" the older man asked, his tone firm but neutral. "Yes," Christian replied, his pulse quickening. "What's going on?" The officer reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, extending it towards him. "Have you seen this boy?" Christian's breath hitched. It was the same boy he had saved the night before, the one who had stood frozen in the street, the one he'd pulled from the path of a speeding car. "Yes," Christian said immediately. "I saw him last night. What happened? Is he all right?" The 2 officers exchanged a quick glance. Something shifted in their expressions. What had been professional detachment now carried an edge of suspicion. "That boy's been missing for 3 days, Mr. Blake." Christian froze. The words echoed in his mind, clashing with the vivid memory of last night. He could recall every detail. The rain, the boy's trembling frame, the address written on that crumpled piece of paper. "That's not possible," he said slowly, shaking his head. "I saved him last night. I walked him to an address he gave me." The officers didn't look convinced. The older one tucked the photo back into his pocket and straightened. "You'll need to come with us to the station, Mr. Blake. We need an official statement." The ride to the station was suffocating. Christian sat in the back of the unmarked police car, his mind racing. He couldn't understand how the timeline didn't match. Was it a mistake, or something else entirely? The officers in the front barely spoke, but Christian could feel their eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, watching him. At the station, things only got stranger. Christian was led to a small, windowless room with harsh fluorescent lights. The walls were bare, the air stale. One of the officers placed a recorder on the table, but it remained off. They began questioning him, not the typical inquiries you'd expect from concerned detectives. These questions felt like traps designed to trip him up. "Where exactly did you find the boy? What time was it when you saw him? Did anyone else see you with him?" Christian answered each question carefully, his frustration mounting with every exchange. But something was off. They weren't writing anything down. They weren't recording his answers. They didn't offer him legal counsel. Instead, they watched him closely, as if waiting for him to slip, to reveal something he wasn't even aware of. "Why are you treating me like a suspect?" Christian finally snapped, his patience worn thin. The older detective leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We're just trying to understand your involvement, Mr. Blake. Things aren't adding up." After hours of this back and forth, they finally let him go. No charges, no explanations, just a cold, dismissive wave as he walked out of the station. When Christian returned home, the first thing he noticed was the front door. It was slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine. He was certain he had locked it before leaving with the police. He hesitated for a moment on the threshold, then pushed the door open slowly, his senses on high alert. Inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. His expensive furniture was untouched. The pristine surfaces of his marble counters gleamed as usual. But something felt off. It was the kind of wrong you couldn't see, only feel. The air was different, heavier. As he moved deeper into the house, his eyes landed on the dining table. There, placed neatly in the center, was a plain, unmarked envelope. Christian's pulse quickened. He approached cautiously, his mind screaming that this was all wrong. With hesitant fingers, he opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was the same boy from the night before, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him were two adults, strangers to Christian. Their faces were partially obscured, but there was something unsettling in their posture. The way they stood too close to the boy, their hands gripping his shoulders a little too tightly. Christian flipped the photo over. On the back, in the same shaky handwriting as the address, was a chilling message. "You've already made your choice." Christian's throat went dry. His mind raced to make sense of it, but before he could process the implications, his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "If you want to stay alive," a voice whispered. It was a child's voice, but there was no fear in it, only cold, calculated calm. "Meet me at the old train station at 10 p.m. Come alone. Don't call the police." The line went dead. Christian stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap, but he also knew he couldn't walk away from it. At exactly 10 o'clock, Christian stood near the old railway station. The place looked abandoned, with rusted tracks glinting under the faint moonlight and shattered windows reflecting the pale glow. The silence was suffocating, amplifying even the faintest sounds. His footsteps on gravel, the distant creak of metal, the subtle rustle of the wind through broken glass. Christian's eyes darted across the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, faster with each passing second. Then, before he could react, strong arms wrapped around him from behind. The grip was vice-like, crushing the breath from his lungs. His body tensed, but it was too late. He didn't have time to shout, to struggle. Everything went dark. When Christian came to, the first thing he felt was the cold. It seeped into his skin from the concrete floor beneath him, sending a shiver up his spine. His wrists were bound tightly behind his back, the rope biting into his skin with every small movement. His head throbbed from a dull ache at the base of his skull, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim, flickering light. Standing before him were two men in black masks. Their faces were obscured, their postures relaxed in a way that made the situation feel even more threatening. One of them crouched down, leaning in close enough that Christian could feel his breath. "Good evening, Mr. Blake," the man said, his tone disturbingly polite. "I'm sure you've figured out by now that none of this is a coincidence." Christian didn't respond. His jaw clenched, and his eyes burned with fury, but he kept silent. Showing emotion wouldn't help him now. The man chuckled softly, as if amused by Christian's defiance. "We know you've got plenty of money," he continued, "and we know you'll pay to protect what's important to you." He pulled out a phone from his pocket and held it up to Christian's face. On the screen was a photo of his sister. She was tied to a chair, her face pale and terrified, a gag stuffed in her mouth. Her eyes, wide with fear, were the worst part. They were pleading, desperate. Christian's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You'll get her back," the man said, sliding the phone back into his pocket. "If you transfer $10 million to the account we'll provide. You have 24 hours. Christian's mind raced, but he knew better than to let his emotions take over. Panic wouldn't help him here. He took a deep breath, trying to focus on what mattered, getting his sister back. "This isn't just about money," Christian finally said, his voice low but steady. "What do you really want?" The masked man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he smiled. Not that Christian could see it, but he could feel it in the smugness of his voice. "Let's just say, it's personal." Christian's heart pounded in his chest. Personal? Who were these people? He didn't have enemies, at least none that he knew of. But this wasn't random. They knew too much about his finances, his family. This was planned. The second man, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was rougher, more impatient. "Don't try to play the hero, Blake," he warned. "Next time we won't be so polite." With that, they turned and walked out of the room, leaving Christian alone in the cold, dark basement, bound and surrounded by questions without answers. Time passed slowly, each second stretching out like an eternity. The cold seeped deeper into Christian's bones, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. His mind raced through every detail, every possibility. Why me? Why my sister? But no answers came. He tested the ropes binding his wrists, feeling for any weakness. The fibers dug into his skin, but he didn't stop. Pain was a distraction he could handle. The real challenge was keeping his mind sharp. As he struggled, his thoughts kept returning to the man's words. It's personal, but how? Who could possibly hold a grudge this deep? Hours felt like days. The silence of the basement was broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. Every sound made Christian's heart race, but no one came back. His thoughts shifted to his sister. He pictured her face, the fear in her eyes. That image fueled his determination. He had to get out. He had to save her. But how? The answer didn't come, and as the hours dragged on, so did the weight of helplessness. The men had left him with nothing. No clues, no way to escape, only a cruel ultimatum and the ticking clock of a 24-hour deadline. Eventually, the sound of footsteps echoed through the basement. Heavy, deliberate steps. Christian tensed, bracing himself for whatever came next. The door creaked open, and one of the masked men stepped inside. He didn't speak. Instead, he tossed something onto the floor in front of Christian, a burner phone. "You'll get the account details soon," the man said curtly. "Don't waste time." Then he left, slamming the door behind him. Christian stared at the phone, his mind spinning. They were giving him a way to communicate. But why? Did they think he'd just pay without a fight? His hands were still tied, but the phone was within reach. He shuffled forward, the rough concrete scraping his knees, and managed to knock the phone closer with his shoulder. It took every ounce of effort, but he finally wedged it between his wrists. Now came the hard part. The screen lit up, displaying a single text message. "Transfer $10 million within 24 hours or your sister dies." There was no number, no way to trace it. Just the message and the knowledge that they were watching, waiting. Christian's mind raced. He couldn't trust the police. They were either incompetent or part of this. He couldn't risk reaching out to friends. He didn't know who he could trust. But he had to do something. He couldn't let them win. As he sat there, staring at the message, a plan began to form in his mind. It was risky, but he didn't have a choice. They wanted a game, he'd give them one. But first, he had to get out of that basement. Christian staggered out of the basement, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. His mind was spinning, but his focus was razor sharp. He didn't have time to process what had just happened. His sister's terrified face haunted him with every step he took. There was only one thing on his mind now: get her back. His first instinct was to call Daniel, his longtime friend and trusted lawyer. Daniel had always been reliable, the kind of person who could fix things quietly. But as the phone rang and went unanswered, a knot of unease twisted in Christian's stomach. He tried again. No response. This wasn't like Daniel. Christian shoved the phone into his pocket and kept moving. The silence on the other end only deepened the pit in his gut. When he finally arrived home, his hands were still trembling. The moment he stepped inside, the familiar sense of security his mansion once provided felt like a cruel joke. The lights flickered as he entered, the cold emptiness of the house pressing down on him. On the dining table, perfectly centered as if placed with care, was another envelope. Christian's breath caught. His pulse quickened. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. This time, the envelope was thicker. Inside was a flash drive. He didn't waste time. He plugged it into his laptop, his hands steady despite the dread pooling in his stomach. The video loaded immediately. It was his sister. She sat in a dimly lit room, her wrists tied to the arms of a chair. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. The same gag was still stuffed in her mouth, but someone off-screen yanked it away. She gasped for air, her lips trembling. "Christian," her voice cracked. "Please do what they say. They're serious." The screen went black. Christian's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The rage simmering beneath his skin threatened to explode, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control now. Going to the police was out of the question. He didn't trust them. Whether they were incompetent or complicit, it didn't matter. They wouldn't help him. He had to handle this himself. Christian pulled up the security footage from the cameras around his property. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, scrubbing through the recordings, searching for anything. Any clue, any shadow, any mistake the kidnappers might have made. But there was nothing. It was as if they'd never been there. The footage was flawless, untouched. Too perfect. Christian leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. These people knew exactly what they were doing. They'd anticipated his every move. He thought back to the strange feelings he'd had over the past few months. The suspicion that someone in his company was leaking information. He'd brushed it off as paranoia at the time, Now he wasn't so sure. There was only one person left he could trust, or at least he hoped he could. Michael, his business partner, his childhood friend. They'd built their company from the ground up together. If there was anyone who could help him now, it was Michael. Christian didn't waste time. He called him immediately. "Mike, I need your help," Christian said the moment the line connected. "What's going on?" Michael's voice was calm, steady, too steady. Christian explained everything about the boy, the police, the kidnapping, the ransom demand. As he spoke, he listened closely to Michael's reactions. At first, Michael seemed genuinely concerned, his responses quick and sympathetic. But then, Christian noticed something, a hesitation, a flicker of something in Michael's voice. Doubt, discomfort, he couldn't quite place it, but it was there. A subtle shift in tone, a pause that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. "We'll find her," Michael said finally. His voice was confident, almost too confident. "Don't worry." But Christian did worry, because that confidence wasn't reassuring. It was suspicious. Christian hung up, but the conversation replayed in his mind. Something wasn't right. Michael had always been supportive, but tonight, there was a strange edge to his voice, a certainty that felt out of place. Why wasn't he more concerned? Why did it feel like he already knew how this would end? Christian's gut told him to be careful. The people behind this weren't strangers. They knew him too well. They knew his routines, his security measures. They knew exactly how to get under his skin. And now, for the first time, Christian wondered if Michael was part of it. He didn't want to believe it, but the nagging doubt refused to leave. That night, Christian couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities. Every memory of his friendship with Michael replayed in his head, but now, each moment felt tainted, like he was seeing it through a new, darker lens. Was Michael capable of something like this? The thought was unbearable, but the facts were undeniable. The next morning, Christian made a decision. He would confront Michael. Not directly, not yet, but he would dig deeper. He would find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Because now, it wasn't just about the ransom. It was about trust and betrayal. The next morning, Christian's phone buzzed again. The number was different, but the threat was the same. "Money, thou, or you'll never see her again." Christian's finger hovered over the banking app, ready to transfer the 10 million. But something made him stop. Michael's face flashed in his mind. His unnerving calm when Christian told him about the kidnapping. The way his voice didn't waver. It didn't add up. Why wasn't his best friend more rattled? Christian made a different call. This time, to Alex Harper, the private investigator he trusted more than anyone else. Within hours, Harper had traced the origin of the calls to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Christian didn't hesitate. He drove there himself. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior blending into the gray morning sky. Christian stepped out of his car, his footsteps muffled by the gravel beneath him. The building looked deserted, but he knew better. He pushed open the creaking metal door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, shafts of light cutting through broken windows. The silence pressed down on him until a voice sliced through the stillness. "I told you not to get involved, Christian." Christian froze. It was Michael. Slowly, Christian stepped forward until he could see him. Michael stood near the center of the warehouse, a gun in his hand. And next to him, tied to a chair, was Christian's sister. Her eyes locked onto his, wide with fear. Christian's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Why?" he asked, staring at the man he'd called his best friend. Michael's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "Because you took everything. The money, the success, even the people who were supposed to be my friends. I was always in your shadow, Christian. Always second best." Christian clenched his fists, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. "This isn't the way, Mike. You don't have to do this." Michael's grip on the gun tightened. "It's the only way. I'm tired of being nothing." Christian took a careful step forward. "Even if you get the money, you won't escape this. You'll never be free from what you've done." Michael laughed bitterly. "I already am." But before Michael could make another move, the warehouse doors burst open. Armed security, hired by Christian the moment suspicion crept in, flooded the space. Michael spun around, but it was too late. The guards disarmed him and pinned him to the ground. Christian rushed to his sister, cutting the ropes from her wrists. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing but alive. It was over. As Michael was restrained, Christian walked over, staring down at the man he had trusted his entire life. "You could have just asked, Mike," he said quietly. his voice heavy with betrayal. "You didn't have to do this." Michael looked up at him, his expression blank, devoid of any remorse. "You never would have given me what I really wanted." "And what's that?" Christian asked, though deep down he already knew. "To be you." Those words echoed in the cold, empty warehouse as Michael was led away. Back home, the mansion felt different. The walls that once offered comfort now felt like barriers. Christian sat alone in his study, staring out at the sprawling estate, his mind replaying every moment. His sister was safe, but nothing else felt secure. Trust was a fragile thing, and once broken, it left scars deeper than any wound. Christian now knew that the greatest threats didn't come from strangers. They came from the people you thought you knew best. And as he sat there, staring at the reflection of his own face in the darkened window, he understood. Money wasn't the root of this evil. It was envy, and it had been sitting beside him all along.